Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. The Covid-19 pathogen has brought daily life to a near standstill. Global and state economies are suffering, jobs are being lost, scientists are working feverishly to find a cure. Big data is trying to figure out the epicurves. This is more than a repeat of the Spanish influenza because the world today is globalized and connected as never before. But while many questions have arisen about what this means, and we've been asking those questions, another question is about security. Does this redefine the idea of security both for states and societies? This question is important also because there were warnings going back to 2007-8. In other words, this didn't just happen. It was not a matter of if and how, but when. Yet states were unprepared. Has the pandemic changed that? Will it? The other aspect is to do with what it means for non-state actors. As technology advances and spreads, so will the capabilities of NSAs enhance. We've been talking about chem bio attacks, but this is different. This is only needs developing a virus infecting one person and then letting that index patient spread it. A scary scenario for sure, but not a fantastic one. Let's discuss this with our panel of experts tonight. We are joined by Mark Sleboda, who is an international affairs and security analyst based in Moscow. We also are joined by Darrell Feingold, who's a political risk analyst and is based in Taipei. And we also have with us Dawson, an author, radio talk show host, and an analyst. Thank you to all the guests here. Let me begin with Mr. Sleboda. Mr. Sleboda, does this redefine security? Let's begin with that, and then we'll get to other aspects of it.
Well, I mean, the obvious answer to that is that it should redefine security. We should have examined the way our governments enact policy and prioritize spending to consider such tragedy of the commons, shared global crises, such as viral pandemics, environmental damage with climate change, and so on long ago. But we haven't done that up till now, despite all the warnings, despite precursors such as SARS and MERS and the H1N1 swine flu originating out of the U.S. We've had precursors to this. The U.S., the Pentagon, has run repeated war games going back to Dark Winter in 2001, urban outbreak just 3 months before the coronavirus. So the Pentagon was wargaming, and what they discovered every time was the U.S. is not prepared for a pandemic of this scale. The U.S. health system, the U.S. security system is not prepared. Everyone knew this was coming, but they hadn't enacted the changes necessary in the prioritization of what security for our states and citizens really means. The priority is always put on other state actors or terrorism and not on such real threats that actually can threaten the lives of tens of thousands, if not millions, of our citizens around the world.
Mr. Sleboda, thank you so much for actually preparing the ground so nicely for this discussion. Let me hop over to Mr. Feingold. Now, Mr. Feingold, here's the thing, as Mr. Sleboda said, there were warnings. Pentagon had been running war games. However, given the fact that we saw spikes in defense expenditure, especially during President Trump's presidency, why is it that money wasn't being allocated to this sort of threat?
Well, there's certainly going to be a lot of criticism once the worst of the virus situation abates about what the U.S. government or federal government or state governments could have done better. But I think we have to also keep in mind that the failure of governments to prepare adequately is certainly not something exclusive to the United States. And there's another issue, which is in recent years, especially after 2008 financial crisis, a lot of governments around the world have been quite unstable. Even some of the Western democracies, there's been frequent changes of government. In Europe, for example, obviously the UK dealt with Brexit. And that brings up another significant issue, which is the failure of multilateral organizations to do a good job as well. Sometimes they are succumbing to political pressure, and that's certainly we're going to see a criticism of the World Health Organization in the coming weeks and months to continue, which is that the WHO, perhaps out of concern for offending China, was a little bit slow to raise the alarm about this situation.
Okay, let me, before I go to Mr. Dawson, clarify that we're not discussing this or criticizing just the United States. The U.S., we talked about the U.S. because Mr. Sleboda said correctly that the Pentagon was warning, and we also know that the United States has the highest defense budget of any other state in the world. It has much deeper coffers compared to any other state. So, yes, it's not just a criticism of the United States, but this was just a sort of, a marker, so to speak. Mr. Dawson, here's the thing. It's very clear that if we were to redefine security in the wake of this virus, then we are looking at a definition which is not the classical structural realist definition in terms of state security, but also security for the people. And there is a bidirectional causality here with reference to security, because if societies get really sick with such pandemics, that also automatically reduces overall security for the state itself. So give me your thoughts on that.
Well, I have to echo what Mr. Sleboda said also. This is something that should have been an alarm bell. After SARS, the state like Japan, where I am, they did take that very seriously. They closed their borders, and they are not having the pandemic effects of the pandemic that other states are having right now. That could change. I hope it doesn't, but bars and restaurants are open, businesses are open, things are thriving in Japan because they took the proper steps. They also have the highest ratio of hospital beds per patient in the world by a considerable gap, followed by South Korea. States like Italy, Spain, and the US did not follow up on that. But if you look at the states that are dealing with this the best, it's Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Russia, Germany. The ones who take their healthcare industry seriously, spend a little less on the military and a little bit more on protecting their people. That's something that needed to happen. But the problem is you have so many industries looking at a crisis as an opportunity to profit. In the United States, for example, when people like Captain Brett Korzer of the Roosevelt did the right thing and talked about the leak of the COVID-19 on his aircraft carrier, he was released. And so they're trying to bury this, and you see stimulus packages that really don't affect fighting COVID-19. It's done under the auspice of this and under the browbeating of people shaking their finger in exponential cases and deaths throughout the world. They needed to close their borders. That was step one. For political reasons, a lot of European states just wouldn't do that, and now it's too late.
Okay, just a quick question on this before I go to Mr. Sleboda. You talk about this is not the time to make a quick buck, but that essentially is what capitalism is all about. And so we see that this is an opportunity, even as the economies slow down and various sectors are badly hit, like aviation, entertainment, film industry, hoteling, the rest of it. There are other sectors that have made a killing. And this is the opportunity that they have. So how do we change that paradigm, if at all we can?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's what capitalism's about. It's what corruption's about. Japan is a capitalist state as well, but they did the right things. Taiwan did the right things too. And states like Germany are handling it a little bit better. But, the places like the United States and Italy too, they've been losing tens of thousands of people every year to the normal flu. Italy loses 22,600 on average from the flu already. And they don't take steps for preventative measures to prevent that either. And it hasn't been paraded around in the media as much, but the normal flu kills over 500,000 people a year globally. COVID-19 hasn't reached those numbers yet, but it will if we don't take drastic measures to curb this. Yeah. But it's every single debate cycle in the United States, they argue about healthcare and how to improve it, and yet it never happens. They never talk about the price. It's always an argument about who's going to pay, whether it's out of taxes or whether it's your employer paying or whether you're paying out of pocket or some combination plus Medicaid and Medicare. They're not talking about why it costs so much when you're sick in the United States, and that's because they don't have free market capitalism and competitive bids to bring down prices. They don't allow competition for insurance across state lines, and so the prices go up, and they use government regulations written by the pharmaceutical industries themselves, written by the other MIC, the medical industrial complex. Yes, and so they will not allow them to negotiate the price of Medicaid, for example. We've got to curb these regulations because not all regulations, but these specific regulations that are written by big business do nothing but ensure wealth for further big business and corruption. That's crony capitalism, and it's never brought up in the debates. It's never brought up in the discussion. Instead, they look for new taxes and way to prop up overpriced industries rather than asking why they cost so much in the first place.
I think that's a very interesting point. Stay with me, Mr. Dawson. Let me go to Mr. Sleboda. Sleboda, one other point that has come up is about the multilateral institutions. Now, here's the thing. What we have seen is that the United States, which is the world leader, which was leading this entire sort of cooperative neoliberal framework, multilateral framework, has been slowly walking back from that. That's one issue. Secondly, over the years, the multilateral institutions are now fattened bureaucracies more than being effective institutions. Your comments, sir?
Yeah, again, part of the problem with the multilateral institutions is, the formation of the international state community through the UN and the UN Security Council that we have. The UN Security Council has been essentially paralyzed during this crisis. They have not even really begun to address how this problem might be solved globally. But again, part of that has to fall back on the responsibility of the United States. The United States considers itself and loudly proclaims itself as the, quote, leader of the free world. And its military, its spending certainly places it head and shoulders in terms of security spending above every other country. If the U.S. wishes to limit the reach and the power of multilateral institutions around the world, which has quite clearly been U.S. Government policy going back decades, then that is a severe limiting power on the United States. The U.S. does not recognize international law as being above U.S. domestic law. And that has to be translated into, again, a decades-long U.S. foreign policy goal of global hegemony. And when the global hegemony is absent from the table, and it is now the global epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic, COVID-19, in no small part because of its simply broken for-profit healthcare system, where 40-some% of Americans have no access to any affordable healthcare whatsoever. The U.S., the crisis is rapidly spinning out of all control in the United States. It's only going to get worse. And we have to remember that this is a global pandemic. Borders can be closed, but borders cannot be closed forever. We're going to see repeated waves of this virus. Once countries open their measures of the worst and weakest states, China is already seeing the virus being exported back into their country from abroad. And that's going to happen with every country in the world. And we're going to see states collapse. They're going to be failed states over this in Africa, in the third world, in South America. And that's why this is a collective response problem. It is a tragedy of the commons. And our multilateral institutions really have to step up that game, but they have to be led. And if the U.S. isn't willing or able to lead in this crisis, then the world had better start looking at countries like China, which has the political will and the ability to do so. And they have to step up their game as well.
Well, one argument that one could possibly make is what kind of state do we need in order to address this? Now, if we look at the China model, then it's A, despotic, and B, efficient. So it's despotism linked to a lot of efficiency in relation to technology. But there are other models. Mr. Feingold There are other models like South Korea, like Taiwan, and Mr. Dawson talked about Japan, Germany to some extent. So are we looking at, in terms of these countries and their responses, are we looking at better allocation priorities, sort of more concern about healthcare systems, a better use of big data and mega technology? What exactly are we looking at?
Well, it's an excellent question, but we do have to keep the perspective that some of the countries you mentioned, such as South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, these are all countries that, from the post-war era, which we've been discussing, and the role of the U.S. during this era in multilateral institutions, but these countries have a long history of a heavy state involvement in economic planning, even though these are nominally capitalist and free market countries, but the cooperation that exists between government and industry, the government involvement in the healthcare system, government ownership of companies that still represent a large portion of these economies is something that has continued to exist in these countries. And we know that is not something that's popular in the United States. It's obviously not an approach that Donald Trump or the voters who will vote for Trump in November will support. And realistically, we saw that Bernie Sanders has been rejected. His brand of socialism is also not popular with voters who are going to vote for the Democrat candidate, which looks likely to be Joe Biden. So there is a cultural difference in discussing these issues. So we can't expect the United States to dramatically change its operating model, notwithstanding the current situation.
Mr. Feingold, without prejudice to what you're saying, I just want to interject, and when we say cultural, I'm always, as a student of political science, I'm kind of wary of this term because it's very nebulous. It does not have very chiseled, shape. It can mean many things, and it can also be deterministic, which has its, another problem altogether. But in terms of what you're saying, and that's a very interesting and important point, what kind of system? I mean, now that we have this crisis, and as Mr. Sleboda said, we're going to have waves of, these pandemics. What kind of system do we need? Now, if we are saying that South Koreans or the Taiwanese or the Japanese have done it better, and they have done it better for X, Y, and Z reasons, and that is something, that situation does not obtain in the United States, then the obvious question is, should other countries emulate where it has worked? Or should even the United States and US voters begin to rethink how their government or their system must work?
We prefer and to be able to work together, notwithstanding what their domestic policies are. Unfortunately, even this has proven difficult in recent years. Again, we're looking at the challenges that the EU has had, or WHO, WTO. We see that it's very difficult, regardless of who's elected leadership in these different countries. The U.S. has been a target of criticism in these organizations, whether George Bush, Barack Obama, or Donald Trump was the president.
Okay. Mr. Dawson, your thoughts on this in terms of, what we are witnessing, response mechanisms, the ability to deal with a crisis situation like this. So in redefining the idea of security, we perhaps also need to redefine what kind of system we want to have in various countries.
Yeah, and I think what you said, we found solutions to this. Where you said China was despotic yet efficient. Japan's not despotic, but still efficient. We've seen different areas, and there's more than one solution. I think in China's case, because this is where the outbreak began, and they had so little information, they went straight that route because they didn't know what else to do. They didn't know how asymptomatic it was, how contagious it was. They didn't have as much information as Japan and South Korea and others who got to handle it a little bit later and with less impact widespread. But it's not just how the states are reacting, it's how the media reacts. For example, and I've watched South Korean and Japanese news, they didn't create this panic state, for example, like in the US, Italy, and other places where you're having shortages on toilet paper and toothpaste and hand sanitizer and things like that.
Panic buying
That
and all
happened
that.
at first in Japan. Yeah, panic buying happened in Japan the first couple days, and immediately the media came on and said, we don't import toilet paper from China. It's all domestic. It's not, there aren't shortages in the supply chain. You don't have to hoard toilet paper, and all of that stopped. So and that makes a big difference. If hand sanitizer is available to all rather than somebody having a closet full, that does make a difference. But the panic buying in the U.S. continued because the panic media continued because fear sells. And so they went out, and now they're having to take turns and wait in line to go to the grocery store and things like that, which is hurting the economy. It's driving people nuts, driving up stress. And it doesn't really prevent the disease because when everybody's waiting in line, they're in crowds anyway. Here, things are pretty normal, other than, people wear masks, but this was a mask culture before COVID-19. People wore a mask anyway.
That is correct.
They're not.
Yeah, I was always surprised, frankly, every time I traveled that side, that lots of people would be wearing masks, especially in undergrounds and buses and the rest of it. But before I wrap up the segment, let me go back to Mr. Sleboda. Mr. Sleboda, I also talked about the NSAs and the fact that their capabilities will also enhance. So, is there a sense of danger in terms of this kind of thing with reference to NSAs?
Well, we're certain that non-state actors, such as they are able, will attempt to exploit this crisis. In particular, Al-Qaeda, the Turkestan Islamic Party, etc., in Syria are attempting to exploit this crisis. But they are not immune from the situation either. And both non-state actors and conventional state militaries we're seeing are starting to experience infection themselves and will find their strength and ability to exert power reduced in all of this. Perhaps the greatest danger seems to be actually U.S. sanctions. I mean, I think it's absolutely genocidal sin of not only maintaining broad, unilateral, illegal economic sanctions on Syria, Venezuela, on Iran, but in several cases actually tightening them during a global pandemic, despite world authority figures such as the UN Secretary General and the leader of the head of the Human Rights Commission, religious leaders from around the world begging the United States.
Absolutely. Geopolitics still to trump everything else. But thank you so much, Mark Sleboda, Ross Darrell, Feingold, and Ryan Dawson for your insights. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the situation in Afghanistan. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. When U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo returned from Afghanistan on 23rd March, he was very unhappy. So unhappy that the State Department said it was cutting $1 billion in aid to Afghanistan this year and potentially another $1 billion in 2021. Reason: Pompeo had failed to persuade rival Afghan leaders to support a unified government. The announcement came as Pompeo was flying back to the United States after meeting with President Ashraf Ghani and the Afghan former chief executive Abdullah. The crisis that threatens to split the government apart and sink hopes of ending the war. That said, all may not be lost. Afghan government representatives have met with a 3-member Taliban team in Kabul to discuss a prisoner swap as part of a peace deal signed by the Taliban and the United States in late February. This was the first time an official Taliban delegation was in the Afghan capital since November 2001. The two sides held face-to-face talks on March 31st and will meet again for further discussions being observed by the International Committee of the Red Cross. Meanwhile, Taliban spokesperson Zabiullah Mujahid has said the group is ready to suspend fighting in their controlled areas if they are hit by the outbreak. But he also clarified that his statement should not be interpreted as a ceasefire. Earlier, the Taliban said they will guarantee the security of health workers traveling to their areas to prevent the spread of the virus. To discuss the situation further, we are joined by Hamdullah Hamdard, who is an analyst based in Kabul, Dr. Jonathan Schroden, an analyst, research program director, and special ops research coordinator. Thank you to both of you. Let me begin with Dr. Schroden here. Dr. Schroden, give me a quick recap and as the situation stands, the sitrep.
Yeah, so where we've been the last couple of weeks, as you said, is Mike Pompeo, Secretary Pompeo, flew to Kabul to try and mediate between the two individuals who have both claimed to be the president of Afghanistan, that's Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah, was unsuccessful in that mediation effort in terms of trying to get them to come to some power sharing agreement. Flew from there to Doha, and on the way to Doha issued the statement that you described, then met with the Taliban in Doha, and apparently had a pretty good meeting with them and left that meeting feeling much better than he left the meeting with Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah, at least based on comments that he made after that trip to Doha, in which he said the Taliban appeared to be largely abiding by their terms of the U.S.-Taliban agreement. That was obviously quite troubling in a lot of ways. The statement that you described that Pompeo issued was pretty dramatic, both in its language and in the scale of the aid or assistance cuts that it threatened to impose upon Afghanistan. Since then, we have seen some movement on the part of the Afghan government. They, as you said, have been in discussions at the sort of technical team level with a delegation of the Taliban on one of the key steps that was to be an early confidence-building measure in the Afghanistan peace talks, which was the exchange of prisoners. And it looks like we're on the verge now of a limited prisoner exchange in which the Afghan government is going to release about 100 Taliban prisoners in exchange for 20 Afghan security force prisoners that the Taliban hold. So that's a positive step forward. On the political situation between Abdullah and Ghani, that remains pretty fraught. Although just this morning I saw Ashraf Ghani made some comments that he may be open to Abdullah either leading or playing a strongly important role in the Afghanistan peace process, which may be his way of now trying to offer Abdullah a bit more than he has in the past. And so hopefully we'll see some movement on that front shortly as well.
Okay, so my sense is, with reference to the prisoner swap, if you recall, President Ashraf Ghani had initially completely rejected the idea, then came around to doing it in phases. The Taliban had at that point said that there are not going to be any talks unless the deal is implemented in terms of the prisoner swap as it was agreed upon between them and the United States. But it seems that the US has managed to get both sides to meet halfway. So that's one thing. And secondly, it does seem to me that Secretary Pompeo's statement with reference to the aid cut shook up both Abdullah and President Ghani in Kabul.
I think that's right. Certainly we've seen movement in positive directions since the threat of aid cuts that Pompeo made, and the prisoner exchange is one example of that. What's interesting about the prisoner exchange, though, is it highlights, I think, what we're going to see a lot of as these peace negotiations continue, which is to say the documents that were signed, that is the U.S.-Taliban agreement and then the joint declaration that was signed between the U.S. and the Afghanistan government on the same day, are both quite vague in a lot of ways. They talk about things like prisoner exchanges, but they don't give a lot of specifics as to how those aspects are to be carried out or what the specific details are in a lot of cases. And so there's some advantages to that. When it comes to diplomatic wrangling, in so much as it gives flexibility to all sides, right, which you need in the context of negotiations. But it also leads to these types of situations where it's not crystal clear across all sides all the time what the details are that everyone is auguring towards. And so I think these sort of fits and starts are to be expected as we continue down this path, and because there are many more difficult issues to work out than prisoner exchanges. So that's one thing. The thing that I find troubling about this, though, is the scale of the threat that it took to get even this smallest of measures, right, what is in effect a confidence-building measure, a prisoner exchange, to come about. If Pompeo is willing to threaten $2 billion of assistance cuts, which is a pretty large share of the amount of money that the U.S. provides in total, to get just limited measure underway, it really calls into question how much further will the U.S. have to ratchet its leverage in order to get these two sides to address some of the much more thorny and sticky issues that will have to be worked out in order to bring a lasting peace to the country.
I completely agree with you on all points. Dr. Jonathan Schroden, thank you for giving us your insights. Mr. Hamdard, give me your read of the situation.
I believe that the peace deal, which was signed between the U.S. and Taliban, especially the prisoner exchange, that is going to happen sooner because the Afghan government has agreed to that. Probably they might have some conditions as well, but that is being implemented and the prisoners are counted in the prisons. The Attorney General office is instructed by His Excellency President's office. So they are counting and making ready all the prisoners for the exchange with the Taliban, and Taliban are doing the same. This thing is going to take place. And from the other side, we also saw, and we had an interview last time, that the negotiating team from the government is also ready, that is announced. This simply means that Mike Pompeo, to some extent, succeeded during his trip regarding the peace talks with President Ashraf Ghani or with the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, and he has also convinced Taliban to start and to go for the intra-Afghan peace talk, and this is a big success for both of them, and especially for Afghanistan, so that the peace deal between the Afghan government and the Taliban will also take place one day sooner. From the other side, Dr. Abdullah's issue, he definitely is trying to gain more and more. And that's why he is bringing more pressure. And even when Mike Pompeo came here to Afghanistan, Dr. Abdullah did not agree with what was offered by President Ashraf Ghani to him, because Dr. Abdullah wanted more, and probably President Ghani did not agree to share the power with him this time, but to give him something from the government, or to give him part in this government. And also he asked Dr. Abdullah to play a key role in the peace negotiation team, as well as in this peace building process. But Abdullah rejected the peace process offer only, and he asked for more. And so far, it seems that President Ashraf Ghani is going to show some more flexibility. He will show some more flexibility so that Dr. Abdullah is also with the government, and they will have a very coordinated and strong voice from the people of Afghanistan to talk or to go for the peace talks with the
So you basically,
Taliban.
Mr. Hamdard, you basically think that we should be expecting some kind of deal between Mr. Ghani, President Ghani, and Mr. Abdullah.
Exactly, but this will not be a power-sharing deal. It will be just the entrance of Dr. Abdullah and his team to the government. It will not be like the last experience we had, which was the Afghanistan or the Afghan National Unity Government, in which there was 50-50 power sharing. This time, the game is a little bit changed. I mean, this deal will be changed. Only Dr. Abdullah will be given some ministries or some positions in the government. He will be given some part or share in the government, but the power will not be shared.
Okay. So, and you think that Abdullah will come round to accepting that? Because earlier you said that he is playing his cards close to the chest, and he's also putting pressure on the government to get, more share in the power. But you really think that ultimately he'll come round. Okay, give me a sense of how Kabul received this announcement of a $1 billion cut in aid.
We saw that when Mike Pompeo visited Kabul and he sat with both President Ashraf Ghani and Dr. Abdullah, and when they did not agree, so it was kind of a pressure from the U.S. To make both President Ashraf Ghani and Dr. Abdullah and even Taliban, so that they all agreed to make this process smoother so that they can go ahead with both the government and with the peace deal or with the peace negotiation process. That was one of the pressures. We witnessed that U.S. announced $7 million once again for the drone operations.
Yeah, $7.1 million, yeah.
Yeah. They will also, I personally believe that it was the $1 billion assistance cut was only for using it as a pressure on the Afghan government, especially on President Ashraf Ghani and Dr. Abdullah. So
but it seems to be, yeah. I agree with you. I agree with you, but it seems to be working. But thank you so much. That was Hamdullah Hamdard speaking with us. This is all for this week. We shall see you next Thursday at the same time. Meanwhile, for latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.